Yeah.
Cool. All right.
All right. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of New World Chaos. I'm Nemo, joined with two excellent guests slash co-hosts today, Zach and Neil. And
Right.
we're going to
Welcome, everyone,
philosophize.
to
Oh, my God. The video accidentally started playing, and I was getting feedback, and that was really confusing. Yeah, this is the first time I'm doing the live show instead of Jeff managing all the tech crap. And we survived. We were talking about just before we went live. We were talking about taking a really short, zoomed-in view of life versus like the bigger picture, kind of zooming in and out. And I was thinking about, say, when you're in nature, if you're just like with some mountains. And these mountains have been around for like millions of years, and in a way, have witnessed everything compared to my life and how it just like really changes my priorities and like what I value. So, Neil, you were about to say something about that with your life too, right before we went live. Do you want to start today?
Yeah, sure. Well, this is a topic that's sort of come up in different things that I'm reading and touching upon. And I like it when the same thing appears in the same thread appears through multiple sources independently. And and so what I was reading was about the sort of concept of looking at our own lives over time and the responsibility we have to our future sort of self. um, uh, and thinking about that as like a community that you're have responsibility for. But what really come out of it for me was when we are able to zoom out from whatever's currently happening in our life, because normally what's happening in our life is so immediate, that it takes up all of our sort of thought space, emotion, and decision making, or at least a large proportion of it. And that can lead to sort of reactionary decision making, as an example. But when we're able to stop and step back and zoom out, sort of more a mindful way of looking at ourselves, to have this longer view, then that can really alter the types of decisions that we make. We can realign our current actions with our future potential. Um, and as for the individual, that's really helpful in keeping on track in life, in growth and development, and also in sort of taking responsible action now that will benefit us in the future. But I think that's also really needed at this community, local, national, global level. Is there's a necessity, I feel, to slow down and step back and take a look at the bigger picture, as well as being able to zoom in to what's current and what's immediate or imminent. So just interesting as a thread that come up in so many different places. But I'd like to hear what you guys think of it as well.
Yeah.
So, well, like for example, right now I am working on planning my future, and not only having a vision of what that future might be, but sort of really stepping back to see how that can be meaningful and purposeful, and what I have now that takes me in that direction, and what I don't have, what decisions I need to make, and possibly even road mapping that out for the next 5, 10, 20 years. Um, and it's amazing how differently I feel and think, and what decisions I feel I should make when I can zoom out, than what feels like I need to do right now. Because often what I need to do right now is solve something immediate, but might actually be, you know, metaphorically taking the wrong turn on a path. So
Yeah.
that's how it's working in my real life, so to speak.
Yeah. I noticed that a lot of people that I would say they take the short-term view, they take the immediate view, and often lack a lot of the long-term view to a degree that they end up falling into trends. And falling into trends seems to be a bigger phenomenon in recent years than in the past. And maybe the internet has contributed to this to some degree. Um, I also think maybe it has to do with real physical life versus virtual life. Virtual life seems to move faster. Thinking moves faster than physical changes. The internet moves a lot faster than real life. And I sometimes I vicariously observe people where I feel like I'm on the outside because I don't experience life the way they do. And, a lot of it, say, for example, are people that support some degree of social justice, which to me is somewhat of a fad right now, and people don't want to admit that it's a fad. They like to think that it's deeper. They're like really trying to perpetuate it and push it forward, but it just is lacking substance to me. And like I've gone to visit the George Floyd Memorial because I live in the cities where it is, the Twin Cities in Minnesota. And in the first like 3 days, it was dramatically different than 9 days later. And then it was dramatically different than like 2 months later. And I think that's partly because it was such a bizarre situation to unfold. It was like cataclysmic in a way. So it changed so quickly and so dramatically. It's like you're in a different world. But now going to it like 9 months to a year later, and the people that I see that are still just like clinging to the initial experience, which was really almost otherworldly, and it wasn't even really politicized yet. And they're the people that cling to that. It's like they want this fad, this short-term view to be this long-term thing. And I don't think they have the bigger perspective to start to question like where is this depth that's going to last long after we're gone. And I don't know. I mean, it's like I can tell because I feel like an outsider looking in, and it's hard to, I guess, describe it more in detail after that. But it's just like things that would have been a huge conflict for me as somebody that is antagonized by social justice, that now, I mean, after not that much time, honestly, they just seem irrelevant. Yeah, I could get into conflicts with people, but it's like there's different layers now. Like I'm starting to notice recently, I've been noticing there's a lot of misanthropy, and antisocialness between men and women when it comes to male-female relationships, especially if it's like romantic relationships. And it seems like a lot of people are so caught up in that it's like they've forgotten what it would be like to have a really authentic and close, caring relationship where you share mutual acceptance and even admiration for each other. And just imagine having that for the rest of your life or a really long time, and how different that is from just being stuck in this moment where you're just miserable and alone. Like people just get stuck and they wallow and they don't even realize it. It's kind of sad. I don't I didn't want to bring us down here, but I don't know. It inspires me to try to be a person that's genuine and empathetic, and be an example that helps pull people out of that maybe and do something new.
Hmm.
I
Yeah,
think that,
people do get trapped into short-term thinking. Oh, sorry, Neil.
no, go
No,
ahead,
Zach,
Zach.
go for it.
Yeah, no, people do get trapped into short-term thinking. Like in Canada where I am, like especially people are very focused on kind of short term, and like I try to talk to people about issues, but I've discovered very rapidly over the last 6 months, like Canadians are extremely apathetic. Like I'm not going to say like there's corruption in our government, but there's corruption. And like, there's just a lot of stuff that's going on. And I try to talk to people about it. They're like, I don't have time to even think about it. And it's like, what do you mean you don't have time to think about national issues? And they're just like, like, and I get it, like people are busy, but it's one of these things where, you know there's one, I guess there's one tragedy of the commons, right, which is where everyone overuses the commons, and like all the farmers bring their cattle to the same field, grass gets eaten, and then no one has any grass to eat. So that's one tragedy. But then the other tragedy is like when no one invests into the commons, and then the commons deteriorates, and then everyone is left with nothing as a foundation to build anything off of, and they're wondering why. Like I'm seeing, at least in Canada, like not to an extreme extent yet, but like things are starting to get a little shaky, you know, and it's interesting to watch. Like I'm making plans, but um yeah, I don't know. It's like no one's investing in the commons, and it's weird because everyone's angry. Everyone says they're angry about the commons, and they get caught up in whatever's in the news that day. But then no one is thinking long term of like, who's in office right now? Like, what's their track record? Well, how have they been voting on things? What were their promises? Like, no one is asking those questions. So it's that's kind of where I'm at from my perspective. Is I'm just seeing kind of apathy towards long term and obsession with the news cycle.
I think, there's something that's come up from what Nemo was saying with regards to sort of social media, and then what you're saying, Zachary, around apathy and short-term thinking, or apathy towards the long term and focus on short-term thinking. And something that I think is happening is that one of the phenomenon of social media is a focus on sort of instant ratings. So how you can like or not like something very quickly, and there's an immediate response to something, and that brings you, at least my experience is, it brings me emotionally into contact with what's happening immediately. So if I post something, for example, and a load of people happen to retweet it and like it, as just one example, I get an emotional rush from that, even though I'm consciously trying not to, even though I'm consciously trying to treat it as just a moment, an instant, a phenomenon that has little actual real weight. I still react to that response, and that has a sort of neurochemical addictive quality to it, or at least an attractive quality to it. And social media has another phenomenon, which is reducing the content size down towards bite-sized pieces of information. And in politics, I've seen an increase in the use of sound bites and spin as a means to communicate complex ideas in very small chunks. And of course, it doesn't work because the devil's in the detail, and the detail gets eliminated. And then I think that one of the consequences of that may be that it becomes increasingly more difficult to have enough information to make really good or even reasonable judgments about the long term, unless you extract yourself from that particular media and how that works, and take yourself back to something like, for example, a library where you sit down and read books properly and learn or spend time. And then that's the kind of cost, isn't it? Like currency of time, in order to understand something well enough to be able to have an emotional connection and commitment to what is actually very meaningful. In the case of the commons is a fantastic example. So I think that there's an interplay between how social media has this reactionary content and reduced content size, and then the apathy that sort of comes out of that. So it does kind of speak like what's actually valuable, and how would we maybe shift away. In this case, I'm feeling myself like zoom out from that type of content and what exists out there that actually informs us better, so that we can make long-term visions and long-term decision making.
Yeah. Coincidentally, I think this podcast is an example of that evolution, that we've started with some more short-term thinking, just as we kind of met each other through what I've been calling the counter movement, mostly counterweight, a couple other groups. And especially with me and Jeff when we first started, and then as Neil got more involved, I noticed that we all really pushed away from just talking about social justice all the time and going for the long term. And like, clearly people come together in movements organically because there's something that's unfulfilling in their lives and their culture, their economy, psychologically, and so forth. And a lot of people will experience that lack even if they can't articulate it yet. And when they come together and start to form this kind of underground movement, whether you want to say it's a renaissance or say look at what happened with Woodstock in the 60s in the US and probably a couple other places, it really seems like that experience itself allows people to see a bigger picture because they don't have to feel alone. And if there's really powerful experiences that are transcending, then it challenges people to step up to something that you could say is a higher calling rather than just wallowing and feeling trapped in maybe external locus of control focused on the outside and being powerless. People might start to experience, what if my story changes? Maybe that I've been living this story that's really repetitive. It's the same old, same old. What if I was willing to experience the pain of being in no man's land? I'm going to do something totally different, or this could completely change. And that to me sounds like the hero's journey. Like that's an opportunity. And also, what I was thinking about with this theme is usually if people want to see the bigger picture, or if it knocks on their door without them choosing it, um, they have to experience vulnerability to move out of that apathy that you're describing, Zach. And usually that is painful because people have avoided it or things just get covered up. So they get used to feeling numb and just kind of disconnected from life. And feeling vulnerable is like this reminder of things being much bigger and more mysterious than we usually give credit for.
Mm-hmm.
There's something beyond what we consider the ordinary.
Yeah, I think Ayn Rand touched a little bit on this, I think, in her philosophy. And one of the things I took away from that, and kind of what I'm taking away from looking at kind of how things are going now with youth, is it seems like a lot of people are terrified by life, and so they don't want to try, and they hate anybody that does, because that reminds them that maybe they could be trying or something. Like maybe I'm projecting or being weird or something, but like it really seems to me like, especially when I'm out and I post things online that are different, even with like the current project that I'm working on, right? Like, the laugh emojis and the comments about like credentials and like, just the people, like there's this real hate for competence, and not even competence. There's just a real hate, because that's what Jordan Peterson says, I think. But like, there's like a real hate for trying, like giving it a shot. I think, I don't know, I could be wrong on that, but it seems like people really don't like that right now.
Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised if some of what you're encountering is this sort of sickly part of this kind of academic hipstery culture. To me, it's a cultural thing that wasn't intended to be that way. It's just like this natural result of people that are focused on other things. Like I think of the original idea of the hipster, especially when it was really popular in, say, the turn of the century, 90s, 2000s. In my experience, at least, part of the idea of the hipster is not caring is cool. Being apathetic is cool. And I always thought that was so bizarre. It's like, what? Okay, so you're literally intentionally continuing to be alive as a living thing on this planet as someone that doesn't care. That just seems like a walking contradiction to me. Living creatures care about something because they're alive. I don't even know how to exactly like articulate it properly because it's so baffling to me. And then there's like academia, which to me just seems very appeal to authority of academia. So, I look at it as this sort of resentfulness that's a result, an unintended result of this pressure to go to college or just stay in school, and just your whole childhood is school and then continue it by going to college. And so it's like this combination of the hipstery apathy, I don't care about anything, and then the academic resentfulness of, well, I spent all this time on this jargon that's not really very meaningful, and it's kind of just BS, but I have all these credentials now. I have this diploma and I had a graduation ceremony. So now I'm just going to complain at people on the internet who are doing the same stuff that I would do with a degree, but they're doing it without asking permission. And I think people, that's just like grating for people because it makes them reflect on their lives negatively. I've gotten a lot of that myself. I've tried to start organizations from the ground up, and I've gotten people respond, like I'll ask people for advice who I think have done really cool things, and some of them are just so sour about it. They're just like, well, I think you're too young to start an organization. And I'm just like, what kind of thinking is that? Isn't that just a waste of time? Like, if a person actually took that advice, now they're just going to sit around and not try to work on themselves or do something meaningful. It's like, how better do you learn than through trial and error, just doing things? That's the best way to learn. And a lot of people hate on it because it's like they cling to this kind of fake world where they're just going to talk about things and disparage actually doing things as not that valuable. Like
Yeah.
putting down blue collar work and elevating this academic work.
While appropriating blue collar aesthetic, ironically.
Yeah. Say more about that. That's an interesting point. Like, what do you mean,
I come from a
Zach?
blue collar town. This is my culture. Well, like, you know how like, I don't know, like they just dress blue collar, even though, except for the glasses. The glasses are always on trend, but everything else is blue collar, and they try to dress down, and you know what I mean? Maybe it's just, I don't know, that's just something that I see where it's like,
Yeah.
maybe because I'm from a blue collar town, and so like I grew up with people dressing a certain way, and then like the suburban folks started dressing that way too. And it's like, but they still somehow manage to look better than the folks who actually do it, who wear, I don't know, I find it's funny.
Yeah, I had a hunch of my own idea of what you were saying. I wanted to hear kind of what you were, like your description as well. I've had quite a few people who are not from the United States that move here, and they tend to be, I don't know, you could say hardworking, and they want to make a better life for themselves, that kind of thing. And they have said to me some variation on rich people dress poor and poor people dress rich. Americans are weird. Like, that's their conclusion. And I kind of noticed what they're talking about. And I think it's just this weird combination of different cultural factors that all just kind of get jumbled up and nothing really makes sense. Like, people who legitimately grow up poor relative to America, like in their context, they're kind of at the bottom, tend to have some maybe degree of insecurity with it. And they tend to, especially as a youth mentor, I notice this, like younger people, especially young men, will try to impress girls they want to get dates with by, I'm going to save up money, I'm going to get a car, even if it's like a crappy car. For that environment, that's like a big deal. And so, well, materialism tends to be prominent. But then, like, people I see who grew up materially wealthy tend to push it away and be embarrassed about it, and so they want to mimic being lower class. And I think it's because the rich are so hated here. I mean, there was a climate strike here a couple years ago, and people were chanting things like "compost the rich" or "let's eat the rich, feed the rich to the poor." And it's like they're trying to pretend that they're materially impoverished. And I think it's because they grow up typically with like really messed up childhoods, and materialism is used to cover that up. That's my guess. And it's just really empty and shallow. I don't know. That's a bit of a rabbit hole. That's what I've noticed, though.
I'm just thinking back to like the rich people that I know. Like there is definitely this thing where like the upper middle class families, because it's all status games, at least where I'm from. Like I come from like a blue collar town, and then there's literally on a hill above the rest of the town, there's like this nicer part of the town, which is like the more wealthy area and everything. And like it's all status games there, and like I think it does show up in the family dynamics, because like the kids have to be put on, like they have to put on a good show for the rest of everyone. And obviously you want your kids to act respectable in public, but like it gets over indexed on. So yeah, and then the materialism as well. Like I don't know. Like here's the weird thing. Like in California or whatever, like if you want to drive a Maserati, it makes sense. But in Canada, like our summer is like 3 months long. Like there's salt on the roads for like 7 or 8 months of the year. You can't drive your Maserati most of the year. So it just doesn't make sense, except, unless you really love Maseratis or you're showing off. And so there's an element of that too, where it's just so impractical.
Yes. You just made me think of, you reminded me of a word actually from when you were describing the blue collar aesthetic earlier. I think there's a term called lumbersexual.
I've heard of this.
That they look kind of like lumberjacks, but just wealthier, fancified. And there's a lot of these commercials that I think are targeted towards men that in the modern day that are just, it's a very odd thing to me. It's just this, it's kind of materialistic. I don't even know. It's very just, it's not my thing at all, but it reminds me of like a lot of the hipster aesthetic. And I saw Jeff was talking in the comments about that, and he kind of agreed with me. I don't know. Neil, what's it like in the UK? Does any of this sound familiar or sound totally different?
There's a couple of things that come up. Like one is sort of going back to a little bit of an earlier thread, was around the sort of surviving and thriving mentality, where when you were saying about when you try to do something and people push back on that, it seems that to me at the moment that surviving is what you're expected to do, and actually thriving, bettering yourself, desiring competence and value are looked down upon. And to me, I think that to me is an echo of people's fear of failure. So their own insecurity around their own competence to achieve means they don't want to see anyone else achieve either. Also, that links to the eat the rich concept, which I saw somebody had actually painted on their rucksack on the train station the other day, and she looked very upper middle class and rich, basically. And she was like, eat the rich. And it's like, yeah, obviously that's just like that's a bullshit aesthetic, because you clearly are doing fine, right? so there is and that links to the blue collar aesthetic concept as well. So thriving is considered something that may lead you to being wealthy, and wealth is considered to be a form of evil at present, at least within Western culture to some degree. I'd say particularly North American and UK culture, there's a strong resonance here with, the rich are the cause of all problems, and all poor people are good. Sort of classically misaligned thinking around. And yet, of course, if that were the case, then you'd want everyone to be poor, so they could all be good, and that's not what we want at all. Yeah, if everyone were rich, then it'd all be evil. So that doesn't work. So that whole simplistic vision of things just doesn't function at all at any level. There is an aesthetic amongst upper middle class and middle class to, not for everyone, obviously, this is a generalization, and I don't wish to try to say that this is true of everyone, but jeans and trainers and t-shirts at board meetings, rather than suits and ties. And so there's a general clothing aesthetic. But what I have noticed in the UK, at least, is that people that do come from a historically higher class, which won't necessarily be connected to wealth. So the class system in the UK is slightly different. So anyone that would be considered to be upper class or upper middle class will dress well all the time and be very proud of it. And so there is still a strong distinction to this is us, and I can tell immediately by somebody's shoes what class they're in. It's like, to me, it's really an obvious signal, and it's a signal that people still resonate strongly with. And I think that we still have an elitism within the UK class system that hasn't been weakened at all, and doesn't shift at all. And what I have noticed from the other end, at least for quite a while, people from very working class backgrounds would want to wear sort of things like Burberry and Donna Karan and Gucci and things that are associated with wealth. And those brands themselves have actually repitched themselves towards a broader demographic, which is generally a lower income bracket as well. So there has been a response to that, at least within clothing and fashion, to switch those high-end brands towards more like people with a blue-collar background, so to speak. So there is this really interesting thing playing out. So what I'm seeing is, in the UK, I don't think it's anywhere near as strong as it is for you guys. And that we definitely have this almost elite class of people that refuse to stop wearing loafers and shirts to every event they go to, including popping to the shop to buy the newspaper. They will be very well dressed on the way, and it's a strong signaling. It is a signal of this is where I belong, and that doesn't seem to be eroding here at all. But below that, it's getting really mixed up. So that is occurring. But the thing that stands out for me the most through this conversation so far is this idea of thriving and competence being rejected on quite a large scale, and potentially the connection to which may lead to people that are actually doing well signaling that they're not, or trying to rebrand themselves almost as being blue collar or at least down with the streets, so as like a really, really old way to say it, like an 80s turn of phrase then. But so yeah, there is something really going on around competence and how you then present yourself and what it might mean to actually care about your future and the future and doing well in it. And what does that mean now? What does it mean to hold your hand up and say, I want to do really well. I want to be successful and I want to contribute to a better community. And I do care about what's going on and I want to be involved. And that almost seems like a borderline unfashionable towards somehow wrong. And I find that quite shocking. And the other thing I find about zooming out is that then you can see history better. And when we look back, we can see the results of that type of thinking in the past, and it's never been good. So keeping zoomed into the now, keeping really close to the frame allows you to ignore history and not care about the future.
Yeah. I like that you brought it full circle. That's pretty cool. Yeah, it does. If we're talking about, people that are really just focused on the moment, that don't really take the time to zoom out, I think something that would really affect a lot of people if they did actually try a thought experiment is to imagine, what will your life be like 5 or 10 or 20 years from now if you just keep doing what you're doing now? And when people are cut off from their vulnerability, I think it leads to this illusion or even maybe a delusion that you're invulnerable, so things just don't change. And I think this actually tortures people, that if you like pay attention to someone who's wallowing in their misery, it's like they feel like they're trapped. And to get out of that, the trade-off you make is to embrace your vulnerability, because that's what connects you to feeling change. That all things change, and there's something deeper about that that's almost like mysterious and otherworldly. It's like the ground under your feet itself is always shifting. And then you yourself, you're always shifting. So this sensation that maybe, say sometimes I have this, I'm pretty sure a lot of people have this. There's this sensation that there's this core reference point, like this center to what I experience, and that it's the same. Because usually it changes so gradually that I'm like the frog in the pot of water that's slowly increasing in temperature. So like it changes slowly enough that we could be simultaneously tortured by what feels like we're trapped in, this thing that never changes, rigidity, and also just not take it seriously that things are vulnerable and constantly changing. And I think that explains a lot of the apathy I see in people, because when they're faced with the opportunity to maybe step up and be responsible, go on their hero's journey or just take a dive, if they're stuck in that invulnerable, rigid experience, it's like they project that on the world and they start to talk about there's all these systems out there that are trapping us and it's miserable, and if the opportunities are in the systems, then they devalue it, because what's the point of pursuing something and giving your life to it if you're just trapped in this system that's terrible? So it's like that. Maybe there's some truth to that, but then there's also some delusion to it, and I think people just get stuck. And that kind of reminds me of how Jordan Peterson talks about hierarchies. And I'm reading his newer book as well. So he's constantly weighing, on one hand, sure, there can be rigidity and things get outdated and start to be destructive and no longer in their positive form, but then you don't just want to blindly tear everything down, because then you're focused on destruction and that creates a horrible future. So I don't know. I mean, I also look at myself, and I think I'm kind of this, I don't know, fringe, random, radical, rebel person a lot of the time. And I'm more on the openness, creativity side of the spectrum. So I tend to not be in a destructive mindset because I literally want to create, but then I also don't fit well in systems. So I just go off and do it myself. And then the apathetic, nihilistic people we're talking about criticize me for it, just like they were doing with Zach. So I don't know. It seems like things are starting to kind of fit together here in my chaotic musing, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it is interesting. Like people like there is yeah, like just this really interesting thing about long-term, short-term, and then kind of how that plays out. I mean, because also like you can think about who you are like 5, 10 years from now, but you can also think of like how you'll be remembered 300 years from now, and then that like changes your outlook dramatically. And that also put a lot of people probably would find that unreasonable. Like, "Oh, I'm going to be remembered in 300 years. Like, that would mean I'd have to do X, Y, Z." And it's like, yes, it would. Um, you know, so it's like it's hard. And so then the question is like you can ask yourself honestly, like, is it important to me to be remembered this far in the future? Oh, and that, or like, would I rather raise a family, and be remembered through my family, right? And so you kind of like pick your investment and like place your bets where you want, I guess, on the future. And maybe that's what it is. Like, people don't want to place their bet on something, because if you put your hand up and you say I'm doing this, you're committing to it, right? And then you have to commit. And you even see this, I guess, in dating, right? Where like for me, I was in polyamory for a little while, and like that movement, I was in it when it was still kind of niche in Canada, but it's really grown and it's become more popular. And it's not necessarily, I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's a valid way to live. Like, I did it for a while, but like um it's one of those things where like some people I can see, like I've talked to some young guys who like they're asking me about polyamory because they knew I was into it, and I could just tell it's like, no man, like you got the wrong idea about it. Like they're trying to be, have a harem or whatever, right? Because they don't want to commit to one woman, right? And it's like it doesn't work like that for so many different reasons. But like, so I don't know, maybe there's this thing about not wanting to commit, not wanting to try, right? Because then you fail. There's like the vulnerability thing. So
Yeah. Yeah, there really is a dichotomy I'm starting to clarify here, which a lot of this I already had a sense of, but I guess I'm just re-articulating it because it's kind of messy to put it all together. But just the dichotomy or the contrast between, say, people like, I would say all three of us fit into a generally more on the creative side versus destructive, especially when you put it in that context. And then a lot of the people I've met who are very apathetic and nihilistic are really in this destructive side. And it's almost like this weird Jungian thing, like Carl Jung, the self versus the shadow self, and that these archetypes are coming out in personalities in different people. And I would say like that, looking at, say, the creative person that wants to grow and innovate things, and then the destructive person that wants to tear things down, really almost looks like a yin and yang to me. So I think part of what makes it messy for me is there's aspects of both that are they need to be understood. It's not just one or the other, and then you just get rid of one and you take on the other. It's aspects of both that come together, especially when you think of things constantly changing is what makes, say, birth and death, so creation and destruction. So I don't think I want to dismiss everything of one side and just take on the other, but seek to understand. And it'd be interesting to see what happens when the two are actually integrated into something more. Like, what kind of person is like that? And I think maybe I see a little bit of it in myself because I'm not the same, like, I'll simplify for a comparison. Something that's different between me and people we would call conservative politically, culturally, is that I am not totally negative about the destructive narrative, tearing things down. I think sometimes systems or culture or whatever gets really rigid, and it legitimately can be toxic, and you have to escape that and then start anew. And it seems like sometimes, say, the people we call conservative automatically assume we should just preserve what is old and that it's always good and we should never do anything new. And then there's the opposite side of that always wants to do new things. But as it continues on, it seems like, I guess, by comparison, the left-wing people have let go of the do new things, innovate and create aspect, and now just want to tear everything down. And I wonder what exactly, like, what kind of archetypes or psychology leads people down this path, this like movement of being the destructive radical. There's something that happens that I think repeats in history that leads people to becoming really destructive.
Well, Nietzsche wrote about this, and so did Dostoevsky. And prior to the rise of sort of Lenin and Marxist communism in Europe, and Nietzsche, Nietzsche wrote that God is dead, but what Nietzsche was writing to was the loss of meaning which come from having a view that the universe was in some way inherently meaningful in its creation. So the move towards materialism and science and trying to understand the objective reality from its physical material perspective in somehow began leading to a sort of what would be the right word? A removal of the spiritual and a removal of inherent meaning. And so both Nietzsche and Dostoevsky predicted the rise of two phenomena, nihilism and social authoritarianism, both of which are happening. So what was predicted has, to some degree, is quite demonstrable now in our society. We've spoken a lot about nihilistic perspectives of the individual, and also about the rise of social authoritarianism in a kind of like, so nihilism is in that case, God is dead and the world is just meaningless, and therefore why try, why commit to anything? And the other side of that, the authoritarianism is kind of, well, we need rules. Like, in a way, God provided a set of rules, at least an ethical, moral sort of set of things to commit to, which interestingly has a long-term aspect to it, not just a short-term. And so the social authoritarianism replaces God's rules with a political structure, but which has never seemed to have worked. And then the next thing that Nietzsche at least wrote about was the Übermensch, the Superman, which is a really easy to misconstrue term. But what he was talking about was the individualization and the rise of the self-determined individual and sovereignty, where inherently one creates a set of values and commits to them. I don't know whether human beings can create their own sets of values. It's a really interesting idea, but there are certainly values to be drawn from that can be reviewed and reflected, that one can then commit to. And that commitment that Zachary's already pointed out people may be avoiding has inherent vulnerability, which is what Nemo, you've been pointing out, is actually quite vital in healthy change, but also something that people tend to avoid. So for me, listening to what you've both been saying, that's being played out, and what I'm experiencing personally is the drive towards, I'm not going to say the Ubermensch Superman, because I just don't want to say I'm trying to become Superman. Right?
Brings us back to Ayn Rand.
Yeah, but at least the recognition that what might guide me in life is a set of values to commit to. And for me personally, that involves zooming right out and looking at myself as an individual, but myself as a member of a local and global community. And how do I leave something that I could look back on in 50 years or 300 years and say, that was worthwhile, that was meaningful. And hopefully, how do I leave the world slightly better than I arrived in? And so I feel like these three things are occurring, at least in my life. I'm seeing the nihilism on a large scale. I'm seeing the rise of authoritarian, socialized authoritarianism, and then experiencing within smaller communities of people such as yourselves and others through Critical Crossroads and other arenas, the move towards, well, how do I as an individual actually create something meaningful, self-determined, and that has a positive impact in the world for myself and for others. And a lot of that, for me at least, vulnerability rises in myself when I think, how do I do that? That feels like a really, really big thing. And that means picking a direction and sticking with it and taking a really big risk. And all the time, my current context, my zoomed in context, my daily life is full of these really rapid signals about how to distract myself from any of that, and is what I'm saying and doing liked or not liked by others, and so that to me is the pull away from what's actually important. So I'm having to zoom out a lot and start asking those questions, and then when I come back in close into my daily life, it's like, how do I enact or embody what I can see from that distance? And I keep looking at the mountain behind Nemo and thinking about Nemo's mountain story, about the mountain that's seen all the wars and seen all of history, and you feel tiny and vulnerable and almost meaningless in that perspective of something that's almost eternally old and huge, and human beings are gone in the blink of an eye. But collectively over time, we've had such a huge impact. And that's part of the community that I want to be part of, the long one, the one that started long before us and stretches long beyond us. Like, I think we can all have a real part to play in that being something beautiful. And that does require destroying or deconstructing or pulling down things that don't work and building things which are better. So that, you're spot on, Nemo. It's so important to recognize that both are important functions. And conservatism works where you're conserving what's good and useful. And progressivism and change and tearing things down works when you're tearing down the things that don't work. But to understand that, you can't understand that from here. You've really got to pull back and see what's worked and not worked in the past and consider what could work in the future, to be able to make those types of conservation and progression and build and destroy type choices.
Yeah. I feel like we touched on this a little bit, but like there is kind of a funny story. Like, have you guys seen The Umbrella Academy?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So like the I don't know if you can picture this, but the front of whatever house they have with the two lions or whatever.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was filmed in my city, and was a historic building or whatever, and it used to be a gay bar actually, called Embassy. So there was a huge issue because that entire block of buildings was slated for demolition, and people were like, they're historic, and but there's this interesting thing, because when you went inside and looked at the buildings, the condition, it's like there was almost nothing that could be done with some of them. And so it's almost like, do we let this thing go? Oh, did I, yeah, do we let this thing go? And like, it'll be sad to let it go, but then we can build something else better that will itself be a historic building in 100 years. Like it's a difficult call to make, but I find people don't want to have those aesthetic conversations as to like, do we refurbish these buildings? Do we tear them down, build something new? Like, what do we do? But I think they're just defaulting to condos because the economy is the economy. So
Yeah. There's certain practicality that kind of takes over. Yeah, Neil, what you were saying was really powerful.
Mhm.
I actually some of the themes that I come into, if I'm taking that long-term view, I look at what I could leave behind that would be a gift to future generations, and not even necessarily just people, but nature, like everything, other species. That's part of the widening of the picture for me. And I think a lot of human beings in history sort of found that archetype that would come to them, and they would express it specifically focusing on their kids. Parents be like, okay, I can suffer through this and it is meaningful to me and it is worth it for the sake of giving my kids a better future. And I think with a lot of the traumatic experiences getting passed down and cycles of abuse and how it's evolved over time, and then say how it's been affected by technology, a lot of parents' best intentions go horribly wrong for their kids. And that some of those best intentions of I'm going to give them a better future gets really warped. And so somewhere along the line, they get carried away from the long-term view and into a shorter-term view. Like we've touched on materialism today in different classes. And when I was growing up, materialism definitely felt very suffocating to me. It was often used for control. It was not a positive thing we experienced, despite the fact of how many generations of people in so many different civilizations have led up to this unbelievable world where what we experience as materialism is like this series of technological developments that is almost incomprehensible. Like just living in a house is this work of freaking Inspector Gadget technology compared to agricultural societies. Just that you have like a toilet and plumbing, and there's all these wires that carry lightning through our houses, and then it powers everything. And now all of a sudden we're virtually connected to each other across space and time. Like it's basically some Houdini shit, if you ask me. But the way that it affects our relationships has just gone totally haywire. And I think a lot of it has to do with unresolved trauma and like the way that people's trauma is related to poverty and war in past times. Like, say, people that grew up in the Great Depression is a really simple example. They tend to hoard things. And so, a modern issue that people suffer is hoarding. And it's very different from most of the suffering that people went through in times past. So, it's just we have a totally different set of problems in our hands. And the attempts of our recent ancestors to give much better lives to their kids has ended up where we are now, and I don't think that is something that our ancestors ever could have imagined. So it's like this constant, it's just the nature of the beast. It's almost like we're playing this game that doesn't have an end, and every generation, each person has to go through these terrible experiences and this kind of sense of being lost, and then question, well, what can I do with what I have been given that is going to last long term, so that it could have this really profound impact that even if everything constantly changes in ways we can't predict, there may be something in it that lasts long enough that has a really beautiful and profound impact. And so we look at art throughout tons of like millennia, that's like it's lasted for a very long time, and we look at these different philosophies. We look at the experience of Siddhartha, or however you say his name. I probably butchered it. Siddhartha becoming Buddha. He just gave up everything materially as a prince, sat under a tree, and now he had this thing called enlightenment, and it's lasted for 2,500 years. It's like it's almost like a process of discovery. Like, what is this thing we discover that really lasts, that is a legacy, that may be something true and deeper, that is way beyond us in the nature of the universe, because it lasts so long that there's something different about it. So of course it makes us feel vulnerable, because it's almost mysterious beyond being human. I guess that's where what's drawing me forward is like discovering that thing that almost can't be said in words.
Yeah, there's something really strong there about the intergenerational aspect of trauma, and how we attempt to defend against that with, say, for example, the example of parents and children. And parents try to give their children the things they didn't have, but it becomes very short term, and it becomes like immediately giving things or immediately protecting them from perceived dangers. But in the long term, as human beings, we need to be able to be vulnerable and take risks and fall over and cut our knees and get back up again. Being protected all the time doesn't help. It makes us fragile. But also we need to heal the traumas. And that's something that doesn't seem to get passed down very well. Like, the greatest gift I think you could give your children would be to heal your traumas, so that they don't have to carry that burden in their life, which inevitably we all do. We all carry our parents and our grandparents. Anything unresolved, remains unresolved and gets passed forward. I believe that anyway. It's from a psychological perspective. You see it a lot in therapy, that when people dig really deep into what bothers them, it turns out to be something that was passed to them. Not always, but quite frequently. Of course, we experience traumas within our own lifetime. I'm not trying to negate that fact, but that's on top of the shit that we pick up from the people in our past. So like, the baggage gets heavier over time, and we need to learn to heal that, both from the past and our own. And you can't avoid being new traumas happening or new difficulties in life, but your ability to meet them and then resolve them within your own lifetime and not hand them down, that increases the more that we can get rid of the baggage we already carry. And I think that's not something that's commonly understood or engaged with. And to be honest, it does sound very difficult to engage with, but it is possible. Mm-hmm. And there's something even about, linking back to what Zach said about that beautiful building used in the Umbrella Academy. There's a very similar.
Only the exterior. Sorry,
only the exterior.
Yeah, the interior. Really? Yeah, the exterior was nice. The interior of that building. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay. No, that's cool. That's cool. I was just, when I first moved to Beijing, which was about 20 odd years ago, about 20 years ago. The first time I moved there, a lot of Beijing was still the old sort of red brick buildings that you'd see in old kung fu films. Like little narrow corridors and square buildings where everything looks inside, and there's a well or a tree in the center, and it was like an old movie, and I just absolutely fell in love with the aesthetic of it. And then the government just ripped most of it down and built shopping centers and new apartments, and almost every foreign person there, particularly people from Europe, were just crying at the tragedy of the loss of these stunning buildings, where every Chinese person was like, fucking yay, progress at last, proper running water and all of these amenities. And I thought that was going to just be the end of old Beijing. But somewhere around maybe 10 years ago, the government stopped and just went, hang on a minute, like, we're losing something really valuable here. And a lot of it now is preserved and is remains stunning, and it's really well looked after, and it really worth visiting. But I think there is a drive in progress which starts with eliminating what was previously there to try to put something new in place. And it can take time, or that moving out, that moving, changing position, to recognize there is actually something valuable from the past too that could be carried forward. That shouldn't prevent progress, but shouldn't be completely eliminated from it. So there is this connection to what's being carried through time, and what do we carry through time that is of value, and then how do we send that forward into the future as well, and what comes to us from the past which really needs to be resolved, perhaps healed and grieved for and moved beyond, and what needs to be preserved. I think these are really important themes and threads that run through history, that we all have kind of somehow maybe a duty within our own personal lives to resolve what's affecting us, and what we pass forward, but also collectively as well, or communally. As collectivism, I find, is a word I'm a bit sticky with, and I'm not too sure I like it, whereas community is something that I really that resonates for me. So I'll say communally, what to be passed forward rather than collectively. But it seems like us on the level of the individual and on the level of the community, and internally and externally, it's exactly the same things need to be looked at.
It's kind of funny we got into architecture because Jordan Peterson has kind of popped up here and there for me, and now I'm just thinking of him saying clean up your room. But I guess to the Chinese government. But it's a funny way that things come back around. Yeah, it seems like there is this tug of war between tearing down and building anew versus preservation. And it's probably challenging for people. There's different layers of meaning, and I imagine, if a lot of people are somewhat apathetic, you could even say this is maybe dissociation, that they're just not feeling their vulnerability because they're just not physically present, like, more deeply. So they're disconnected on a nervous system level. And we talked about trauma, and if that's what people are dealing with, it's almost like you could say they're literally insensitive. Their senses are numbed or disconnected. So it's got to be hard for people in those states to be connected to their intuition. And if you spend long periods of time disconnected, then your intuition could be stunted. And so instead of developing it deeper, that could carry you to that sense of long-term, a deeper place of wisdom, it's almost like that part of you doesn't mature because you don't get to spend time in it if you're in traumatic states all the time. And so I guess that kind of gives me that view of empathizing with people in those states that are apathetic. It just gets hard to deal with as an outsider because so many people will maintain that state deliberately. They sort of push people away. I've heard therapists use the metaphor of the porcupine that wants to be hugged, and people in those that I've met with that way of being, they just sort of get deeper and deeper into ideology because they want to explain their suffering with a story where it makes sense rather than considering ways they could evolve. And so they just get into these grand narratives that make the destructive mindset feel more grandiose and heroic, like I'm going to go slay the dragon. Some of the people I've been around who are, you could say, kind of the destructive left-wing underground, they talk about taking over. We're back in buildings again. They talk about taking over these luxury buildings in our area. There are new buildings that get built that it's almost like an unintentional Ponzi scheme where they artificially raise the property value and they stay empty because the market is way oversaturated for that. And the people building them, the companies, will just keep doing it and they don't even care that they stay empty because they'll just sell it for more money down the road. So it's basically a Ponzi scheme. It's not creating something of actual value to the market, to communities, and it pushes out the mom and pop landlords. And so it's one of the plagues or aspects of the plague of the housing crisis for us. So now there's all these kind of destructive left-wing radical types like Black Bloc and Antifa, and they want to go take over these buildings and be squatters and say, we're going to have these, a bunch of homeless people. Now they have a place to live, and we're going to take over these buildings and claim it as our own. And that's going to be our revolution, and subverting things by just taking it over. But the whole thing just seems really miserable. It's like you have to live this miserable life where you're making yourself more at odds with everything around you and just more in conflict with people. And it just lacks the creative side of it. Like, why don't you just go and build your own houses and homes without asking anybody's permission, and just go do that and start new communities? I mean, as an alternative, but that's just one of the ways I see it play out, where just it goes to a really dark place. I've spent time around those people, and it gets really hard to be around people in those places because you just get sucked into this dark place that it's not easy for people to go into that place and be able to come out of it. It's like you have to tether yourself and then jump off of the cliff and into the abyss. Otherwise, if you look into the abyss long enough, it looks into you. Is that Nietzsche? We're back on that. Yeah.
Now, there is something there about the grandiose projects. Like they take, like, I'll give you an example of how this plays out in Canada. Like, there's an issue. The Catholic Church in Canada was partially at fault, not necessarily the Vatican, as far as I know. And the government was mostly at fault. So the Catholic Church in Canada has already offered apologies and some restitution, from my understanding. However, the government is being completely recalcitrant and is like being just belligerent and barely helping. And everyone in Canada is focused on an apology from the Vatican, which is literally another country. And that's kind of this grandiose thing because they're taking a swing directly at the Pope and they're going to make the Pope say something. And that's like a 2-year project. Like anything that comes out of the Pope's mouth is like premeditated, like 2 years in advance. Like everyone probably signs off on it, right? So they're committing themselves to this project, but meanwhile, like there's the government in their own country that they could be like directly pressuring and maybe actually get some things done at a humanitarian level, but like no one is thinking of that. And even our own government is asking for an apology from another country. So it's like it becomes like, and that's not maybe a good example necessarily of a grandiose project, but it's an example of this kind of misplaced, because I guess all the energy has to go somewhere, and it may as well go into trying to take down the most ambitious system you can think of, which is, I don't know, like in a lot of cases, it's like for the anarchists, it's the government, So I guess that's probably, we don't have too many anarchists in my town, but there are some. They smashed up my neighborhood like 2 years ago. But you know what I mean? Like it's like this project that they take on.
Yeah. Yeah, it also seems disconnected from physical reality. It's this weird thing where a lot of the destructive tendencies, when they come out in these radical ways, the way I see it is there's something about it that is coming out in people's actions that may have been repressed, or they're just struggling with those experiences, those feelings, and they don't have a place to put it, and it sort of corrupts them over time until it just like explodes. And it seems like it's this part of it is this desire for physicality, for physical life. As I was talking about people, say, being dissociated or just out of their bodies. So it's like if you're really doing like destroying things physically, there is something really physically intense about it. And it's like that desire for physicality that's part of like the healing process, but it comes out in this really nasty way. And yet at the same time, it almost doesn't make any sense. If you skip all the stories and like the mental aspects, and you just kind of look around at what's happening in front of you, say if I was to go and vicariously observe some George Floyd protests last year, just as a guy walking down the street or whatever, and I didn't pay attention to any of the stories, like the things I could interpret in my head, and I just look at what's in front of me, it really doesn't make any sense. It's like, all right, so here's some people that are in like these kind of bulky green patterned uniforms, and they're all dressed the same, I guess, and then they're carrying big guns, and then they're trying to intimidate other people, and then these other people are dressed in black, and they're kind of skinny, and they're like throwing things at the people in the green uniforms, and they're also destroying things. Okay, and then there's those people, and they're going to smash some windows, and I guess now that building doesn't have windows, and then I guess they're setting something on fire, and everyone's going to breathe in the fumes, and they'll probably get cancer in 50 years. Even that is already carrying me away from what's happening in front of me. It's so hard to stay with what's right in front of you, but if you can, in the simplest way possible, just directly what is here, it's literally just people mindlessly breaking things. And it's like, okay, so now what's left? A pile of rubble? What does that do? What does that even accomplish? I don't get what the result of that is. How is that tied to your grand story? And that's where the disconnect comes in. Like all these events we've been seeing is that when you go back to the story and you see maybe what's actually happening, they just ended up attacking people mindlessly. Like just your own neighbors' houses are now destroyed and the businesses they go to are now destroyed. What does this have to do with this ideology of destroying people in power or whatever? So it's almost like the ideology prevents people from connecting with reality. They can't make their ideology physically real because they can't point to an individual and then go and destroy the thing that is the evil. It's too broad. It's too collective. The collective evil they have to destroy. So it's just like this weird disconnect that gets really disorienting. Like Zach, when you said the phrase, they destroyed my neighborhood a few years ago. Well, why would they be motivated to do that? What exactly how is your neighborhood physically connected to this supposed evil they're trying to get rid of? It
Oh,
it discombobulates my brain. It just doesn't make sense.
it is funny. So the neighborhood that I'm in, the street that they smashed up had some of the smaller bit nicer small businesses in the city. And so their whole thing was, F capitalism, whatever. But the irony was, so they march down the whole street and they smash everything they can. And then they decide as they get to the Starbucks to stop smashing and bolt and run. So they smashed up everything except like their workplace, I guess. But like, I don't know. It was so weird because like to me, the first thing you smash is Starbucks. And perhaps the only thing you smash is Starbucks. Right. And like,
Agree
so,
completely, and yeah,
and like, I
of
like
anything
Starbucks. I'm not going to say you smash Starbucks. Like, I like Starbucks. I go there. But like, if I was an anarchist, you want to pick the biggest corporation, but they picked like the cupcake shop.
yeah, that's what I was going to point to, is that and it to me doesn't even sound like anarchism, but I'm sure that's how they label themselves. But what I'm hearing is, yeah, the thing that is the strongest representation of sort of capitalist hegemony within that neighborhood would be the chain store organization with global presence, whether that was Starbucks or a Coca-Cola outlet or Nike store, or something that has that global reach and therefore is probably most disconnected from local lives and what really matters to local people, should be the thing that would be targeted first if there is any sensible, and I mean as in sense making, enactment of that sort of ideology of rip down those sort of the global powers, right? And so it is so disconnected, and there's something that comes up for me from what Nemo was saying about being either insensitive or desensitized, and essentially, and then destroying things as essentially a somatic experience. an almost cathartic, somatic experience, which sounds like what was enacted in your neighborhood, Zach, was that catharsism, which clearly wasn't connected to an ideology. Otherwise, it would have been more specifically targeted away from the cupcake shop and towards the towards the Starbucks. And in the same agreement, I love Starbucks. I go there all the time. But if I were to be trying to destroy global power, then that's the freaking thing I'd be going for. So there's a very strong disconnect there. And what I think it might, well, my view on it, at least, let's put it that way, is that these grandiose projects that people seek to enact or destroy or participate in, they're really low resolution, broad stroke concepts. Like, so they're like the really old black and white TVs, you know, or pixelated sort of screens. They're so low res, you can't really make anything out. And that's because you're taking something which is actually very nuanced and requires a great deal of detail to be understood, and therefore takes a commitment to the understanding of what's actually going on and a commitment to finding real solutions that work. That's hard work, right? That may be a lifetime job right there, just to resolve genuine issues. So fuck that, just low res, give it one name, lay all evils upon that one name, and then go out and smash that up. And then somatically I can kind of resolve some disturbed energy, the disturbed energy being maybe partly intergenerational trauma, partly lifetime experience, but probably in large part the inner knowledge that says, for me to really resolve this, I've got to put in the work, and I can't, or I'm not going to, because I made that lazy, or I don't feel like I can do it. I don't feel I've got the competence, whether you have or not. As long as you don't feel that you've got it, and that can be so frustrating. You can start to feel useless, and that can boil up into a kind of physical disconnect, desensitizing, and not being able to experience yourself properly. And then eventually that comes out by, I'm gonna break things. Like we do it as kids. Like I remember breaking things as a child, and then looking back and really regretting it. But when it starts to play out as an adult, then that's a really serious issue. And I think it's an issue of the scale of things that require resolution also requires a scale of thinking, thought, competence. It takes time. It's not immediate. You can't solve poverty, for example, in that 15-minute discussion. It could take generations of thought to try to resolve these issues properly. So no, I'm just going to point out that one thing, say that's the problem, I'm going to attack that, and then that's going to get this weird feeling out my body, and then I can actually go to Starbucks on the way home and grab a coffee. So yeah, I'm so sorry to hear about your neighborhood getting screwed up by stupid people.
Yeah, it is what it is. My city is so weird. Like, you know, everything happens here, man. Like, I guess everything happens in every city, but like, you know how, I guess in the United States, the joke sometimes, there's a Twitter account like called Florida Man, which is just all like every time if someone like a man from Florida gets arrested and it gets posted on the police websites, somehow someone made a web crawler that gets aggregated or something into this one Twitter account. And so you see all like just the bizarre things like involving crocodiles or whatever, just mishaps and other misunderstandings. Right. But in Hamilton, like, I don't know, there was one time like at Halloween, this made it into the paper. Someone dressed as a Tyrannosaurus Rex got into a fist fight with someone dressed as a red crayon. And like in the newspaper, they made sure to specify, I think, I could be remembering it wrong, but I think they specified the color of the crayon or something. And it's like, those are the types of things that go on in my city, plus like all the other weird stuff like anarchists. But
Yeah.
I just can't believe they didn't smash up the Starbucks.
That's funny. Actually, when you first said that, at first I thought the story was going the direction where they're like, "Oh, let's take a break. We've smashed a lot," and they're gonna go to Starbucks and like get something to drink. Just total lack of self-awareness. That would have been funny. And I could definitely see that happening, especially around here. When Neil, when you were talking, something occurred to me that when we kind of describe some of this destructive ideology, I realized that is their form of the long-term view. That the ideology is a long-term view that's messed up and, as you'd say, low resolution. And so if you're not conscious in developing that long term, and I would say probably in between, you want to develop, really short term, kind of a couple of steps in the middle, and then long term, like Jordan Peterson talks about, so you can kind of start building yourself a path and adjust as you need to. And if you don't do that consciously and you're stuck, say, usually in the short term, then you end up building a path kind of blindly and unintentionally. Like there's the short term lifestyle ends up building on itself, and it usually goes in a bad direction because it tends to be hedonistic and also lacking in depth. And for some people, I think that they can't really cope with having this hedonistic shallow life. They're longing for something deeper, something more purposeful and challenging, but they keep avoiding it. And so ideology develops to make it seem as if they have meaning in life and purpose, and in a way where it becomes more apparent of just how limited their understanding of meaning and purpose and depth is. So like whatever they build in their belief system that's supposed to be more meaningful ends up being kind of low resolution and kind of limited. And I'm going to go and slay a dragon is effectively what it turns into. Greek mythology, but worse. The hipster version of Greek mythology is going to take us all down.
It does satisfy a very strong urge to be on the side of what's good. Like it does play out of that. Do you want to be the empire or the rebellion? It's a very simplistic perspective, and most ideologies are incredibly simplistic in their worldview. But it does have immediate satisfaction. Like in the short term, it really does give something, probably neurochemical, that people crave: meaning, purpose, righteousness, course of action, and quite possibly the opportunity to be in touch with our body through the process of destruction. And that's what's really dangerous about it, I guess, is the immediacy, the short term, the low resolution, and the fact that what it's, if anything, all it's doing is allowing people to kind of express their trauma, but not really resolve it. That kind of pisses me off, I'll be honest. Like, and I know myself personally that especially when younger, I've participated in that process myself. Like I'm no saint. So there's in my 20s, I was very anti-authoritarian, and I've taken part in acts of vandalism I'm not proud of, but I can hold my hands up to it. I can certainly look back and understand why that appealed to me at that time. And that was mainly because I was not in touch with myself as a person, not physically, not psychologically, not emotionally. I was very disconnected. And it was so easy to say that somebody or something else's fault. And I can now name that thing and then aim my aggression at that thing, and then I feel good. And now I look back and go, oh, stupid boy. What were you doing? Thankfully, it didn't cause any serious harm, not to people, especially maybe a little bit of property damage. And if I ever get pulled up on that, then I'll just have to pay the price. But, it can turn really bad. It can lead to really terrible things. So it's really important to try to understand what's the underlying root causes of this, and maybe what do we as individuals do about it, and can our doing something about it, and our having discussions like this and creating forums and spaces for people to kind of listen in, join in, and explore themselves within safely, the safe third space for someone just trying to explore their own stuff. And does that help on a wider scale make a difference. So something I'm thinking about as we've been talking is, as a consequence of this conversation today, what am I going to do differently, or what am I going to embrace that will help me zoom out, take that long term. I love Zachary's statement about, what if you look back at yourself from 300 years, that really changes things. I've never attempted to do that, so I'm going to attempt to do that. That's one thing I'm definitely going to take away. But I'm also going to try to take away is, what is sacred to me, i.e. what don't I challenge? What ideas do I hold that I don't challenge? And I've heard someone else say this, name them as your sacred cows, and then sacrifice your sacred cows and grieve for their loss and see how you feel afterwards. So I'm going to take the 300-year perspective, and I'm going to try to examine the things that are so important to me I don't challenge them, and see what happens if I give them up. Because there's a true vulnerability in that space. And I think, Nemo, you've touched on this many times before, and I think you've got it. I think you've nailed it. The importance of vulnerability is paramount to us being really human and really being ourselves. So yeah, so I found today, like personally, this has been like a growth conversation for me. So thank you both very much. Yeah, that's what I'm getting from this.
Amen. Yeah, I didn't even know what exactly was going to happen today. And yeah, this was a really good one. I think that's really cool. You're going to kind of turn some of today's themes into like an actual thought exercise and self-reflection. That I think I'm going to do similar things. I've also been on a similar path recently anyways, because I wrote a very long self-reflection that took some of the key themes in the last 10 years of my life and tied them together. So I think people tend to avoid the feeling of being lost and aimless, or being in no man's land, being groundless. But if you can get curious about it and actually explore it, then it really is a process of shifting how you experience life and perspective. And that people, when they resist, they actually kind of keep themselves stuck in feeling that sense of groundlessness, because it's almost like there is a literal physicality to your perception, your value system. Like there's a physicality to your values if you think of, say, addiction versus being in a healthy relationship with life, where if you're ready to evolve beyond that, but you hold back because groundlessness or vulnerability is painful, then it's almost like you're guaranteeing yourself to continue feeling that groundlessness. Like you're staying stuck in that stage. You can't really go backwards. You're just going to stay stuck in this physicality of where you are, what you feel. The almost physical feeling of your value system is limited, and it's almost like you can feel, I'm ready to grow beyond this. I can tell there's something with this experience that is not covering a gap in real life. I'm ready to expand to something else. And I don't know, it almost reminds me of like people that avoid throwing up. Well, it's only going to feel worse as you go on. And eventually you get to the point where you're like, all right, it's better if I just throw up.
That's a good analogy. I like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Zach, I think we're coming up to an hour and a half. Zach, any last thoughts on the matter?
I mean, in terms of takeaways, like ironically, I think I might need to focus on my short term a little bit more. Like I've spent the last 6, 7 months, 8 months planning out kind of a long-term vision, and now it's a matter of executing. So I find there's this tension between the short term and the long term, and making sure you have strong values, but also making sure that you're working towards them consistently. So yeah, I don't know. It's this whole conversation has been really thought provoking. So yeah, I'm glad you guys had me.
Yeah, I think that's so important, Zach, that ability to zoom back in and make sure you're actually doing things that are in alignment. Because each step, if you're going to go forward, then you need to take each step, and each step does require being present right there with it. So yeah, that's maybe something that hadn't come out clearly, but at least from my perspective, they're equally important to be able to do both. You need to do, for me, I'd like to say, rather than tell everybody else what to do with their lives, that's not my thing. Zooming out, zooming back in, zooming out, zooming back in. It's the combination of those which really can give you a long-term path and the ability to achieve it. Because it's, if you have a great long-term vision and don't do anything about it, then you're kind of just as stuck as what we were talking about before. So yeah, great that you brought that to life and made sure that that's really clear.
Yeah, amen to that. Well, thanks for joining me on the show. While Jeff's been in the comments today, he's not on video. And Neil, Zach, this has been awesome. And strangely enough, even my background kind of played a role in the theme, so that's pretty cool. And yeah, I guess we will see what happens in the future. And if anybody in the audience is hearing us now and you want to ever contact us on the show, our email is jeffandnemo@gmail.com. Otherwise, we are New World Chaos on YouTube, and you can talk to us in our groups. We're in our own Discord, Critical Crossroads, and also I'm in Counterweight, and a bunch of us are active there. We got all kinds of groups happening, so just find us online. We'll have links, and we'll see you guys in the future.